There's secrets that palaces swallow whole. And then there's secrets that walk out the front gate wearing a dead woman's diamonds. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not a tabloid fever dream stitched together from anonymous sources and grudges. This is a story about what happens when power assumes it has made itself invisible, and one man, standing at a gate, doing his job, doing nothing more than his job, refuses to look away. His name does not matter to the palace. That is the first thing you need to understand. Royal guards are furniture with heartbeats. They stand. They watch. They do not speak unless spoken to, do not flinch, do not blink at the cameras, do not react when grown adults press their faces 2 inches from theirs to take photographs for social media. They're trained to be walls. Decorative, ceremonial, entirely without opinion. But walls see everything. And in the autumn of 2003, one particular wall saw something that would crack him open for the rest of his life. His name was Thomas Fellows. 31 years old, 11 years in service. The kind of man who ironed his civilian shirts the same way he ironed his uniform, with the precision of someone who believed that how you did the small things told the truth about how you'd handle the large ones. He had joined the household cavalry at 20, not because he burned with patriotic fire, but because his father had served and his grandfather before that, and there was a kind of gravity in the family line that pulled men like Thomas toward the gates of those great stone buildings without their quite choosing it. He was not political. He had no particular feelings about the monarchy as an institution. The way a surgeon has no particular feelings about the hospital is simply the place where the work happens. He respected the protocols. He respected the chain of command. He had spent 11 years perfecting the art of seeing without appearing to see, of registering detail without registering emotion. That discipline would cost him everything and save him from a different kind of loss entirely. It began the way most things begin, without any sense of beginning. October. That particular London gray that isn't quite rain and isn't quite cloud, just a permanent bruised weight above the city that makes the streetlights feel apologetic. Thomas was on a secondary gate rotation. Not the main ceremonial entrance, but a service access point used for deliveries, private vehicles, and the kind of movement that the palace preferred not to be photographed. He had done this rotation hundreds of times. He knew the vehicles. He knew the drivers. He knew, with the sixth sense that comes from years of standing still and watching when something was routine and when something was performing routine while being anything but. The car that came through at 1443 that afternoon was a black Range Rover. Private plate. He had seen it before, 3, perhaps 4 times over the preceding 18 months. It was associated with one of the household administrative staff, a coordinator who handled the logistics of private functions. Nothing unusual. What was unusual was the back seat, through the tinted glass, and Thomas had trained his eyes, over years, to read tinted glass the way a naturalist reads water. He caught the shape of a case. A presentation case. The kind used for jewelry. Not a jewelry box. A presentation case. The difference mattered. A jewelry box is personal. A presentation case is transactional. It has a lid engineered for display, for showing rather than keeping, for the moment of exchange rather than the moment of storage. He noted it, filed it, said nothing. The car was waved through by his colleague on the other side of the gate. Standard procedure, known vehicle, staff rotation. Thomas had no authority to stop it, and no reason to, beyond a feeling in his chest that he would later describe, to exactly one person, as the sensation of swallowing a stone. He went home that evening, made dinner, called his mother, did not mention the stone. 3 weeks later, the car came back. Same time, same gate, same driver, different case. This one was larger, flat-sided, the kind used for display jewelry. The pieces that are laid flat for viewing, not stored upright. Thomas could see, just barely, the edge of velvet interior through the gap where the case had not been fully latched. Red velvet. The royal household used blue. He had been inside enough private rooms, stood outside enough closed doors, carried enough silent knowledge in his body about the aesthetic grammar of that world, to know that red velvet did not come from inside. It was going in, or going through, something being moved, something that did not belong to that red velvet case, or that case did not belong to where it was going. He noted the plate number this time. A different car, same type, same tint. He noted the time. He noted the driver, who was not the same as the first, a woman he did not recognize, in civilian clothes, with the particular practiced relaxation of someone who has learned to move through spaces they don't quite have clearance for by behaving as though they have every clearance imaginable. Thomas had seen that posture before, on people smuggling things, on people who had convinced themselves that confidence was the same as permission. He had not stopped the car. He was not supposed to stop the car. He had nothing official, nothing he could articulate in a report, nothing beyond the stone in his chest that had grown in 3 weeks to roughly the size of a fist. He went home, did not call his mother, sat at his kitchen table until 11 o'clock at night, writing nothing on a piece of paper that he kept folding and refolding until the creases went soft. He started paying attention differently after that. Not visibly differently. Thomas was too trained for visible differences. But internally the machinery shifted. He had been passive recording for 11 years, the way a camera records without caring. Now he was watching. The distinction was subtle and total. He began cross-referencing, not in any official system. He had no access to inventory records, no clearance for estate documentation, no legitimate reason to ask questions about what moved in and out of which rooms. But he had something better than clearance. He had invisibility. He was furniture. And furniture, if it pays attention, learns a house better than anyone who lives in it. He started talking to the housekeeping staff. Casually, the way you talk about nothing when you're actually listening for something. He talked to the older women who had been in service for 20, 30 years, who remembered things the official record did not bother to keep. Not because they were told to remember, but because they were the kind of women who understood that memory was the only power available to people in their position. One of them, he will call her Margaret in this account because that is not her name, told him something in November between the serving of tea and the clearing of a side table, with the practiced casualness of a woman who has been saying dangerous things safely for 40 years. She said that some of the pieces were gone. Not all. Not in a way that made a gap you could point to, but she had been in those rooms. She had dusted those cases. She had the kind of intimate knowledge of objects that comes from caring for them. The way a mother knows her child's face so completely that she sees a fever before the thermometer does. Some pieces that had been there were not there anymore. Not recently. Over time. Quietly. One here, one there, the way a slow leak empties a tank. You don't notice the level dropping until one day you notice the bottom. Thomas asked her, carefully, gently, as if the question were nothing. Which pieces? Margaret looked at him over her teacup with the expression of a woman deciding something. Then she set the cup down and said 3 words. Diana's pieces. The stone in Thomas's chest became a boulder. He needed to understand what he was dealing with before he did anything that could not be undone. This was not paranoia. This was professionalism. He had been trained to assess a situation completely before acting. Rushing was for amateurs. Rushing got people killed, or worse, discredited. He spent the next 6 weeks learning everything he could through legitimate means. Not about the jewelry specifically. That path was closed to him. But about the administrative layer around it. About who had authority over what. About the chain of custody protocols for estate items. About the specific category of personal effects left behind when a member of the royal family died. What he learned, assembled piece by piece from conversations and documents and the kind of institutional knowledge that lives in the bodies of long-serving staff rather than any written record, was this: Diana's personal jewelry, not the tiaras and formal pieces that belonged to the crown, but her own things, the pieces she had bought herself or been given privately, the jewelry she had worn because she chose to rather than because protocol required it, was technically part of her estate, held in trust for her sons. Technically. What Thomas began to understand, in the slow and terrible way that understanding sometimes arrives, not as a flash, but as a tide, each wave bringing a little more of the ocean, was that technically and actually were not the same word. Not in that world. Not when the people with access to actually had every reason to ensure that technically remained a version of record. He began to see the shape of it. Not all at once. In pieces, the way you assemble something in a dark room, fitting edges by feel before you ever see the whole picture. And the shape, once he began to feel its edges, was worse than he had imagined. Because it did not look like theft. It looked like administration. It looked like the ordinary movement of estate items, the routine management of a household, the kind of paperwork-heavy, logistical process that produces so much documentation that the documentation itself becomes the camouflage. This was not a smash and grab. This was architecture. Someone had built a structure around it. Someone who understood how institutions process things. Someone who knew that the most effective hiding place is always, always inside the ordinary. December. Christmas decorations on the mall. Tourists in inadequate coats. Thomas standing at the gate in the particular stillness that 11 years of practice had made second nature, watching the Range Rover come through for the third time. He had the plate number. He had the dates. He had Margaret's words, which he had written down, verbatim, in the small notebook he kept in his inside jacket pocket, the one that had previously held nothing more incriminating than lunch orders and telephone numbers. He had the shape of something that he could not yet prove, but could not unknow, and he had a decision to make. The decision was not about courage. Thomas would tell you this himself, if you asked him, with the slight impatience of a man who finds the framing sentimental. He was not brave in that moment. Brave implies a choice between fear and action. What Thomas felt was not fear. What he felt was clarity. Not the comfortable clarity of a man who knows what's right and chooses it nobly. The cold, inconvenient clarity of a man who has seen something he cannot unsee and whose sense of himself, not his career, not his safety, his actual self, will not allow him to pretend otherwise. He let the car through. Then he took out the notebook, and he started writing the report that would end his career, expose a decades-long theft from a dead woman's estate, and bring the full, terrible weight of palace politics down on one man's head. His own. He knew what was coming. He wasn't naive. He had spent 11 years watching how institutions handle inconvenient truths, which is to say, not with gratitude. He wrote anyway, because some things, once you've seen them, cannot be left in the dark, even when the dark has considerably better lawyers. The report went nowhere. This is what people don't understand about institutional power. It doesn't crush things dramatically. It doesn't send men in dark cars. It doesn't issue threats. That is the cinema version, and cinema needs its villains legible, its conflict visible, its danger to make noise. Real power absorbs. Thomas submitted the report through the correct channels. He filled out the correct forms. He used the correct language. Careful, specific, professional, stripped of adjective, full of date and time and plate number and verbatim quotation. He had written it 6 times before he was satisfied. He understood that anything emotional, anything that could be read as personal, anything that smelled of grievance rather than observation, will be processed as grievance rather than observation. He was not grieving. He was reporting. The report went to his immediate superior, a man named Colonel Ashford, career military, 28 years of service, the kind of face that has learned to express exactly as much as protocol requires, and precisely nothing beyond it. Ashford read the report. Thomas sat across from him and watched him read it with the attentiveness of a man watching someone defuse a bomb, except the bomb was the report, and the person defusing it was not doing so to make it safe. Ashford looked up when he finished. He said, "Leave it with me." That was all. Thomas went back to his post. He stood at his gate. He watched the city move. He waited. 3 weeks passed. He heard nothing. In the 4th week, he was quietly reassigned. Not dismissed. Dismissed would have been too legible, too actionable, too much the kind of thing that a man with a notebook full of dates and plate numbers might take somewhere uncomfortable. He was reassigned to a ceremonial rotation. The public-facing, camera-heavy, tourist-adjacent posting that is, in the vocabulary of the household cavalry, approximately the equivalent of being sent to alphabetize the filing room. It was not a punishment. It was a message. Messages of this kind, Thomas understood, were not meant to be argued with. They were meant to be received, processed, and accepted the way weather is accepted, not because you agree with it, but because arguing with weather is the particular province of people who have not yet understood what weather is. He accepted the rotation. He did not destroy the notebook. January 2004. Thomas had spent the preceding month doing what the palace assumed he was doing, which was cooling down, getting the message, understanding the geography of his situation. They were not wrong that he had received the message. They were wrong about what he planned to do with it. He had spent the month building a parallel record, not within the system. The system had already demonstrated what it did with records that inconvenienced it. Outside it, in the way that people who understand institutions and have grown up in institutions and have watched institutions for 11 years, know how to build things outside the institution without appearing to. He had contacts, not dramatic ones, not journalists, not whistleblower organizations, not anyone with a platform or an agenda. He had the ordinary contacts of a man who has spent a decade in service. People who had also left, or been moved, or been silenced in the gentle, administrative way that leaves no marks. People who, when Thomas reached out with the particular careful phrasing he had developed, understood what was being asked and why, and decided, in the privacy of their own kitchens, what they were willing to do about it. Some said no. He had expected that. No was safe. No was reasonable. He did not blame them. Some said nothing, which is different from no, which is a door left unlocked. Two said yes. One of them was Margaret. She came to him not with documents. She had no documents, but with specifics. The specifics of a woman who had spent 30 years in close physical proximity to things that mattered, who had cleaned and cataloged and maintained and remembered, and whose memory was the kind that institutions cannot confiscate because they don't know it exists. She described pieces, specific pieces, not by their estate names or catalog designations. She had no access to those, but by the way a woman who loves beautiful things describes them. By color, by shape, by weight, by the particular way they caught light in a specific room at a specific time of day. By what Diana had worn with them. By what Diana had said about them. The small personal comments that attend objects that are loved rather than merely owned. Thomas wrote everything down. The second person who said yes was a man named Greer, former logistics administrator, 10 years in Royal Household Service, departed under circumstances described officially as voluntary and understood universally as anything but. Greer had numbers. Not the inventory numbers. Those were sealed, but the movement numbers. The dates. The authorized transport documentation that had accompanied certain estate transfers. Documentation that, when you looked at it correctly, described the movement of items and quantities that did not match the estate manifest as it had been documented at the time of Diana's death. Not a large discrepancy. A careful one. The kind of discrepancy that is designed to survive casual review, to pass the inspection of someone not specifically looking, to be explainable as administrative error, if ever directly questioned. But Greer had been a logistics man. He did not do casual review. He had noticed the discrepancy years earlier, when he still worked there, and had done nothing. Not out of cowardice, he would tell Thomas, but out of the calculation that one man with a number and no power was an anecdote, not a case. Now, with Thomas, he was part of something that might be a case. The three of them, Thomas, Margaret, Greer, met exactly once in person in a pub in Hammersmith that none of them had been to before, that none of them went to again. They compared what they had. They talked for 3 hours. They ordered food and ate it because not eating would have looked like urgency, and urgency in a pub is conspicuous. When they left, separately, at 15-minute intervals, they had a picture. The picture was this. Over a period beginning no later than 18 months after Diana's death, and extending at minimum 5 years, possibly longer, a systematic removal of personal jewelry items from the estate had occurred. Not chaotically, not impulsively, with planning and structure and the kind of careful administrative cover that does not improvise, that is built by someone who understands the institutional terrain. The items moved through a private channel, not stolen in the crude sense, not pocketed, not walked out in a handbag. Documented, with paperwork, with authorized signatures, transferred with the language of legitimate estate management, the vocabulary of responsible stewardship, the grammar of people doing their jobs correctly. Except the jobs they were doing were not their jobs, and the items being transferred did not belong to the people transferring them. They belonged to two young men who had lost their mother on a road in Paris and were now, without knowing it, losing her again. Piece by piece, through a process designed to look like nothing, in the hands of people who had calculated correctly, as it turned out for longer than they should have, that no one would look. The question that Thomas lived with during those weeks in Hammersmith, in his flat, at his ceremonial post, where tourists photographed him with their phones in landscape mode, was the question of attribution. He knew what was happening. He had the shape of it. He had the dates, the movement records, Greer's numbers, Margaret's testimony about which pieces were gone. He had a picture of the architecture. What he didn't have, what the picture kept obscuring, kept placing in its own shadow, was the top of the chain. Someone had authorized this. Someone had given, explicitly or implicitly, the instruction that these pieces should move. Someone occupied the apex of this structure, and the structure cleverly pointed in several directions at once, which is what structures built by people who know what they're doing always do. Thomas was not a detective. He did not have investigative powers. He could not subpoena. He could not interview under caution. He could not walk into a room and demand access to documents that people with considerably more authority than him had decided he should not have access to. What he had was time, patience, and the trained eye of a man who had spent 11 years watching people while appearing to watch nothing. He watched. He had been reassigned to a ceremonial rotation, which meant he was, more than at any previous point in his career, physically present in public spaces where people moved without the guard they maintained in private. Public exposure, paradoxically, makes people careless. They perform composure rather than practicing it. And performance, to Thomas's trained eye, had a specific texture. He watched the administrative layer, the coordinators, the household managers, the people who moved between the private spaces, and the public-facing ones who carried information between rooms, who were present at functions and meetings and the kind of informal moments that occur in institutional settings and are never written down. He was watching for the thing that does not match, the small misalignment, the tell. He found it not in a person, but in a pattern. Certain items, jewelry, specifically always jewelry, appeared at private functions organized by or associated with a specific set of names. Not in any flagrant way, not worn ostentatiously, not displayed, not announced, but present in the way that things that have been moved tend to reappear in the world of the person who moved them. He had Margaret's descriptions. He had memorized them the way he had memorized everything that mattered, completely, without effort. The descriptions organized his mind by category and detail the way he organized everything. He began cross-referencing the descriptions against what he saw. It took 4 months. In May of 2004, at a private fundraising function to which Thomas's ceremonial rotation brought him as visible, unimportant background, he saw it. A bracelet, gold, a specific weight, a specific setting, a specific pattern that Margaret had described in the pub in Hammersmith with the authority of a woman who had held it in her hands while cleaning it for 16 years. It was on a wrist, and the wrist was attached to a woman who had no business wearing it. He did not react. This is important. He had 11 years of not reacting. He stood at his post and looked at nothing and saw everything, and he felt the stone in his chest, which had never left, which had only grown denser and stranger over the months, become for one moment absolutely still. He memorized the setting, the other guests, the layout of the room, the angle of the light, the precise position of the bracelet on the wrist, the face above the wrist, composed and social and performing warmth in the way that people perform warmth at fundraising functions when they are there to be seen being warm rather than to feel it. He noted everything. He went home and opened the notebook. He added 5 lines. They were the most important lines in the notebook, and he knew it, and he wrote them with the same careful, specific date and time precision with which he had written everything else. And then he closed the notebook and sat in his kitchen for a long time in the dark. He had the apex. He had, finally, the top of the chain. And the name at the top of the chain was a name that, even now, even knowing what he knew, even with the boulder in his chest, and the notebook in his pocket, and the particular cold clarity that had replaced every other feeling he used to have, even now, made his stomach turn over. Not because it surprised him, because it didn't. Because some part of him, the part that had been standing at gates watching the truth of things for 11 years, had known for months what the name was going to be. He had just been hoping he was wrong. He was not wrong. He never was. The name was Camilla. Not spoken. Not written anywhere that anyone would find. Not announced in Thomas's kitchen, or in his notebook, or in the 3 conversations he had with himself between midnight and, for in the morning over the 3 nights following the fundraiser, sitting in the same chair, in the dark that felt the same as every dark except heavier. Camilla Parker Bowles. By 2004, already in the process of becoming the thing she had spent 2 decades working to become. The thing standing at the altar, the thing beside the air, the thing replacing the woman whose jewelry Thomas had just seen on her wrist at a fundraising dinner for a charity that would have horrified the woman who once owned it. He turned it over. Not the accusation. Not yet. The possibility. He turned the possibility over the way you handle something that might be alive, might be dangerous, might detonate if you grip it wrong. He considered the alternatives with the rigor of a man who understood what it would cost if he was wrong, which was everything, and what it would cost if he was right, and said nothing, which was something harder to name, but equally total. He was not wrong. He had eliminated the alternatives. He had spent 4 months eliminating them, one by one, with the systematic patience of a man who knows that the first answer is almost never the true one, who tests and retests, who would rather spend 6 more weeks being sure than spend the rest of his life being sorry. He was sure. The bracelet was Diana's. Margaret had described it to him in Hammersmith with enough specificity. The clasp, the setting, the small asymmetry in the third link from the left that was not a flaw, but a repair that Diana had chosen to keep visible because she liked the idea that beautiful things could be mended without pretending they hadn't broken, that Thomas could have identified it in a darkened room. The chain of custody connected with Greer's numbers from Diana's estate through a series of administrative transfers to a private holding facility that was, on paper, associated with household estates management, but was, in practice, controlled by a small set of signatures. One of those signatures appeared with a frequency that was statistically improbable if the process were genuinely administrative and entirely coherent if it were not. The signature belonged to a coordinator named Helen Marsh, who Thomas had now researched as thoroughly as a man with no investigative authority and considerable patience can research another person. Helen Marsh had been in Royal Household Service since 1996. She had, in 2001, received a personal commendation for her management of private function logistics, a commendation that came from a direction that, viewed from Thomas's current vantage point, looked less like recognition and more like binding. He understood now why the car had always come through the service gate and never the main entrance. Not because it was practical, because the service gate was on his rotation, and his rotation at the time the movement had begun would have been unremarkable. A junior guard, good record, no trouble, no history of making things difficult. They had not counted on 11 years of standing, still making a man very good at seeing. The question that replaced how and who is now, not what had happened. He knew what had happened. What came next? What Thomas Fellows, 32 years old, 11 years in service, stationed at a ceremonial post as a quiet institutional warning, was going to do with a notebook full of dates and descriptions and plate numbers and one devastating entry in May of 2000 for that he had not shown to Margaret or Greer because the risk of sharing it had changed the moment the name at the top became what it was. The original report had gone through channels and been absorbed. He had expected that. He had not, at the time of writing it, yet known the name, and so he had not yet understood quite how complete the absorption would need to be and why Colonel Ashford's face had arranged itself so carefully into nothing when he read it. Now he understood. Ashford had known. Not known in the sense of being complicit. Thomas did not believe that. Ashford was a military man, a rule follower, a person for whom the correct procedure was the correct procedure, and the hierarchy was the hierarchy, and those two things together constituted something close to a moral system. What Ashford had done, Thomas now believed, was exactly what a man of a particular formation does when a report lands on his desk that, if acted upon, will create a problem for a figure considerably above his pay grade. He had escalated it to exactly the level above him, where it would be managed. And whoever sat at that level above him had made the management decision that absorbed it. Not Ashford's fault. Not entirely. But the road through channels was permanently closed, and Thomas had known for months that it was, and he had been building his parallel record not because he believed in the parallel record as an end in itself, but because the parallel record was the only thing he had that existed outside the institution. Outside the institution was where he now needed to go. This was not a decision he made dramatically. He did not pace his flat or stare out of rain-streaked windows or feel the cinematic weight of a moment. He made it the way he made most decisions, completely, practically, after eliminating all the alternatives in the chair in the kitchen at an unremarkable hour of an unremarkable evening. He was going to take the notebook outside, and outside, in this context, had a specific meaning that he had been very careful about. Not the press. Not directly. Thomas had no illusions about the press and what it did with material about the royal family. It sensationalized, it simplified, it converted complexity into headline, it served its own appetite first, and the truth somewhere further back in the queue. He was not interested in sensation. He was interested in accountability, and those two things in a media ecosystem of 2004 were not the same address. Not any political figure. Not any official body. The official bodies had already proven their relationship to this kind of material. What he needed was something rarer and more specific, a person inside the institution with sufficient authority, sufficient independence, and sufficient personal investment in the truth of Diana's estate that they would know what to do with what he had and would have both the standing and the motivation to do it. He had been thinking about this since January. He had been narrowing the field since February. By June, he had a name. Not a powerful name in the conventional sense. Not a title. A lawyer. A woman named Isabel Crane, who had been part of the legal team involved in the administration of Diana's estate in the first years following her death, who had left private practice in 2001 under circumstances that were described publicly as a career change and understood by the very small number of people who knew the relevant details as something considerably more complicated. Crane had seen something. Thomas did not know exactly what. He had only fragments, a reference in a document that Greer had once had access to, a comment from a former colleague of Crane's that had been passed to Thomas through two intermediaries, the kind of chain that is long enough to be deniable and short enough to be traceable. But the fragments pointed consistently in one direction. Crane had been uncomfortable with something in the estate administration. She had raised it quietly within the legal team. She had been managed. She had left. She had not spoken publicly because she was bound by professional obligations, by the specific confidentiality requirements that attach to legal representation of royal estates, and because Thomas suspected she had spent 3 years calculating the same thing he had, whether a person with half a picture and no institutional backing has any realistic chance of making that picture matter. He thought she would recognize what he had. He thought she would understand what it meant together with what she knew. He thought that the two fragments, joined, might constitute something that existed in the world as more than suspicion. He had no way to approach her through any official channel. He was a reassigned ceremonial guard. She was a former royal estate lawyer. The Venn diagram of their professional lives did not overlap. He wrote her a letter. He wrote it 11 times. Not because he couldn't find the words. He was not a man who struggled with words. Because he understood the extraordinary precision required by a document that needs to communicate everything while revealing only what is safe, that needs to compel someone to engage without giving that person ground for dismissal, that must walk the exact edge between enough and too much without stepping off either side. The 11th version was 4 paragraphs. Each paragraph was 3 sentences. He read it 20 times after he finished it, looking for any sentence that could be read in a way he had not intended, any phrase that could be used against him, any word that carried more freight than the letter could safely bear. He was satisfied with it on a Tuesday in June. He mailed it on the Wednesday. He sent it to a residential address that he had obtained through legitimate public records. Crane had bought a house in 2002, and property purchases are part of the public record. With a return address that was a P.O. box he had opened the previous March under circumstances he was careful to make difficult to trace back to his name quickly. Then, he went back to standing at his gate. Furniture with a heartbeat. He waited. 17 days later, he received a letter at the P.O. box. 2 sentences. The first sentence said, "I read your letter 3 times. The second sentence said, "Thursday, 7 o'clock. The place on the corner of Harrington and Steele. No name. No signature." A handwriting style that was careful in the way that people who have spent careers writing things that matter are careful. The deliberate pressure of someone who understands that words are permanent. He went on Thursday. She was already there when he arrived, at a table in the back corner with a view of both entrances, a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and the expression of a woman who has spent 3 years thinking about a thing and has finally, in her 7th decade of life, run out of patience with not saying it. She was 61 years old. She wore no jewelry. He noticed that. He sat down. He put the notebook on the table between them without opening it. He said, "I've been standing at that gate for 11 years. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, she said, "Tell me what you've seen." So he told her. He talked for 2.5 hours. She did not interrupt him once. She did not ask him to slow down or repeat himself or clarify. She listened the way a lawyer listens, completely, with the kind of attention that is also a form of weighing, that is assessing credibility and corroboration and the gaps where the story doesn't quite connect with itself. When he finished, she picked up her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Then, she put the cup down and said, "The documentation gaps you're describing, I know where they come from. I know because I tried to address them in 2001 and was told the estate had been properly administered and I should focus on the elements of my brief that were relevant to my engagement." She said it flatly, not bitterly, the way someone states a fact that they have long since finished being angry about, because anger was a stage they passed through years ago, and what replaced it was something cooler and more durable. "They were wrong," she said, "and I have documentation of my own." Thomas looked at her across the table. "Together," he said. "Together," she said. She reached into her bag. She placed a folder on the table beside his notebook. It was maybe an inch thick, held together with a clip, the corners worn in the way of something that has been taken out and put back many times over several years. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. "What we do with this," he said. She said, "We do what should have been done in 1998. We make it impossible to absorb." The stone in Thomas's chest, the one he had swallowed at the gate on that October afternoon in 2003, the one that had grown and calcified and become part of his interior architecture over 18 months of seeing and recording and waiting, the stone shifted. Not dissolved, did not go away, but moved, like something that has been fixed for a long time, suddenly in motion, like a door, long sealed, beginning at last to open.